Good morning and welcome to my channel. Sorry if there's a bit of noise in the background, I'm not sure if you can hear it, but there seems to be some sort of a police raid underway on the flats across the road. So hopefully that won't disturb us too much. If there's any gunfire, I may be required to duck, but that's London for you. Anyway, I've written another little story rather, based on 5 random words, and the random words for this week's story are as follows. This one's a little longer than usual. I haven't actually counted the words, but I think it's like 2,500, so hopefully I'll get through it. And it's called, quick sip of coffee, obviously. Writer fuel. No, that's not the name of the story. The name of the story is Overleaf. I'd always wanted to own and run a bookshop, and finally, at the age of 55, I'm doing just that. It might have cost me my marriage, my health, 2 heart attacks within 5 years, and my nerves. I'm on a daily anti-anxiety medication. But Overleaf Books is finally a reality. If you take the correct turning off Edinburgh's Royal Mile and negotiate the somewhat erratic steps on Carrubbers Close, you'll find us. The stone arches of my shop used to contain the wine cellars of a now defunct inn, as well as the stables for travellers' horses. Now they're filled with the wit, wisdom and waywardness of thinkers and entertainers from across the globe, stretching from a new translation of Beowulf to critiques of postmodernism. I shamelessly curate my collection, rather than simply filling my limited floor space with Harry Potter ephemera. When I decided to realise my dream, I was perfectly aware that the publishing industry, particularly in terms of traditional books, was in decline. It didn't bother me. At the very least, the lack of customers allows me to indulge my love of reading, and perhaps I'll finally finish that historical novel I've been writing about the Highland clearances. I sell just enough books to keep the shop afloat, and I'm thinking of coming off the sertraline. Living the dream, some might say. Recently, however, something decidedly odd has been happening. I took on a part-time assistant 4 weeks ago, more to allow me to take the occasional break or go to the bathroom as for any economic reason. Her name is Emily, and she's a philosophy student who, fortunately, shares my high degree of tolerance for silence and solitude. She's also something of an alphabetical savant, able to shelve a trolley load of books in a matter of minutes. Finally, Emily possesses multiple facial piercings and a hard stare that would make Paddington quail. She is not prone to superstitious imaginings, nor does she seem the type for elaborate pranks. So when she came to me on a wet Tuesday afternoon just before closing, with an ashen face, I was immediately concerned. "What is it, Emily?" I inquired. "John," she began, almost embarrassed, "someone keeps turning the books round." She led me down to the lower arches, which are accessed from the main room by a small flight of wooden steps. You have to duck as you descend, a precaution I'd failed to take all too often. If Emily hadn't been with me, I might have suspected that one of my regular head injuries was responsible for what I saw. On every shelf lining the small arched space, occasional books had been turned round, so that their spines faced inward and the pale edges of their pages stood out between the spines of the more conventionally arrayed titles. All in all, there must be 50 or more books misfiled in this way. I turned to my young colleague with an unfinished question on my lips. "Emily, who could have—" "Well, nobody," she said hastily. "I was down here just 5 minutes ago and the shelves were fine. We've not had any customers since then." She let the implication hang as we both set about turning the books back round and tried to dispel any spooky assumptions. I guess I might have missed someone," said Emily without any real conviction in her voice. "A customer could have slipped by me. I replaced the last book, a Tenniel illustrated Alice in Wonderland, and we shut up the shop without a further word on the subject, emerging onto the Royal Mile as a delicate rose-hued sunset began. The following morning, I was due to open up by myself, Emily having a full programme of lectures on Wednesdays. I switched everything on, prepared the float for the till, and read through the morning's emails and online orders. Yes, I'll admit, I bowed to my nephew's suggestion to join the 21st century, and now sell roughly 40% of my books via the internet. All the time I was resisting an urge to run downstairs and check the shelves, almost a fear that I'd see something I couldn't explain. By the time I finally gave in to the surge, just 3 minutes before opening time, I had prepared myself for a world-shattering revelation. I crept down the stairs and turned the corner like an M.R. James-styled academic, tiptoeing into a crypt. Fortunately, nothing had evidently changed overnight, and the books were arrayed just as perfectly and rationally as ever. Relieved, I exhaled a deep breath I hadn't even realised I'd been holding, and went to unlock the front doors. 40 minutes later I had my first customer, a jovial middle-aged woman who bought 3 books, including a complete Borges story collection, which to my mind marked her as a reader of rare distinction. "I do like your unconventional filing system," she said, as she presented her card for payment. "My what?" I asked, reaching for the complimentary bookmarks. "Turning every 13th book to the wall. It really piques curiosity." I smiled grimly and handed her her tote bag of purchases. Then, the minute she left the shop, dashed downstairs to the cellar to investigate. As my customer had intimated, the strange phenomenon had happened again. I counted the books between those turned around. There were indeed 12 with their spines out for every reverse text. My mind began to race. My friend Jamil has a set of keys for the shop in case of emergencies, and because he lives within a 20-minute walk of the old town, but he's a barrister without any evident sense of humour or love of practical jokes. It couldn't be him, surely. Next I looked at the specific books which had been turned round to see if there was any linking theme, any clue as to why these individual books should be manhandled in this way. Edwin Abbott's Flatland, Tolkien's The Silmarillion, Kingsley's Water Babies, a popular science book about the many worlds interpretation of quantum physics, Aristophanes' The Birds, the complete novels of Franz Kafka. The Phantom Book Turner perhaps had a penchant for fantasy, but I could see little else to link the titles, and besides, I too enjoy books about alternative realities. Such subject matter is to be found everywhere on Overleaf's shelves. As I turned the errant books round, I decided that at lunchtime I'd call Jamil and Emily to check whether either of them had perhaps inadvertently loaned the shop keys to a trickster acquaintance. That had to be the explanation. When I'd almost completed my repair job, I could hear someone clearing their throat in the main room. Evidently I'd missed the sound of the little Victorian bell by the door that tinkles whenever someone enters the shop. I went upstairs to help Mr. Andropoulos, a regular customer, who was buying a present for his granddaughter and trying to decide which of the 2 pocket birdwatching guides was best. Advising him took no more than 5 minutes. I managed to persuade Mr. Andropoulos to get both titles. I am not entirely of that sales nous. Then, without any conscious thought leading my footsteps that way, I found myself descending to the cellar once more. What I saw there came close to giving me my 3rd heart attack. At least 70 books had magically inverted themselves, this time taking as their organising principle the Fibonacci sequence. 2 reversed books, then a gap of 2, then another back-to-front title, and then gaps of 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, and so forth. It staggered me. "Who's here?" I found myself asking the walls, an audible quaver in my voice. This was crazy. Someone must have sneaked by me while I'd been intent on discussing Scottish seabirds with Mr. Andropoulos. There was no reply. I began removing books from the shelves, this time noticing that the titles seemed to have nothing at all in common. The book-moving wraith had evidently focused purely on its mathematical scheme this time round. I opened one of the books, the Everyman edition of Wuthering Heights, and turned to the last page, my eyes flicking down to the famous last lines. "How anyone could ever imagine unquiet slumbers for the sleepers in that quiet earth." All well and good, except it was now the penultimate line of the novel, which somehow now ended thus. And yet, given the tumultuous passage of those lives, I fancied I might yet catch the sound of some anguished soul adrift on the wind. I listened then, and am listening still. What? That's not how I remembered the book's conclusion. Was this some alternative manuscript, an academic oddity? I flicked to the frontispiece, but it presented no answers. I chose another reverse book to see if it too had been tampered with. Primo Levi's The Periodic Table. This was a book I'd read and loved as a young man, but I was sure I couldn't quote anything from it. Nevertheless, I turned to the contents page and all seemed present and correct. 21 chapters, each named after a different chemical element. There was a second copy of the book, this one spine out, on the shelf beside the reverse text, so I compared their contents. Immediately I spotted a discrepancy. Instead of Levy's chapter on cerium, in the misfiled book there was one on antimony. a rare metal used in bullets, batteries, and bearings. The chapter was the same length as the Levy original, but told a wholly different story. Now I was more than baffled, I was worried. I ran upstairs and locked the front door, then returned to my inquiries. I made a pile of the reverse books and began to go through them. There was a copy of Ulysses, whose final chapter ended with a capitalized and resounding "No!" There was a slim Murakami volume, What I Talk About When I Talk About Swimming, and a series of crime novels by Patricia Highsmith Jones. Even Dante's Inferno was radically different, consisting of 4 sections, the final one being Oblio, which detailed the eventual slowing down and diminution of the universe, a heat death predicted 700 years before physicists posited the steady state entropic annihilation of all that we know. I was agog. There could be no ready explanation for this. I was either the victim of some infernally devious conceptual prank, or what exactly? I couldn't even begin to formulate a coherent explanation. Feeling suddenly weak at the knees, I grabbed for the nearest shelf, needing to feel something solid between my fingers. I was lost in a Borgesian labyrinth of equally untenable possibilities. I have no idea how long I stood there, propped up like a listing stack of books, numb with incomprehension. Eventually, my concentration was shattered by a harsh knocking on the front door. I looked at my watch. 3:10 p.m. I had somehow lost 2 hours. I ran to let Emily in. She'd been due to join me at 3 p.m. and had been knocking and trying to call the shop landline for 10 minutes. She looked concerned by my evidently distracted appearance, and I hastily explained what had transpired. "Can you think of anyone who might possibly have obtained your keys?" I asked. "Not at all," she replied, demonstrating that her shop keys were on the same fob as her home set, which she kept on her person at all times. "Then it must be one of Jamil's friends. I must call him. But first, come and see," I insisted, leading Emily down to the lower floor. There, both of us came face to face with a paradigm-shifting vision, and our worlds altered forever. The pile of books in the middle of the floor had vanished, and every single book was back on the shelves, except with their spines facing towards the wall, along with every other title in the shop. Emily ran upstairs and witnessed the same phenomenon there too. Shelf after shelf of unknowably mysterious text, the whiteness of all those edges actually making the room a little brighter, reflecting more of the fluorescent illumination. The transformation was complete, and it had taken approximately 90 seconds. I no longer felt afraid. In fact, I laughed aloud, which probably did little to reassure my concerned employee as to the status of my sanity. We picked a few books off the shelves, and I was easily able to demonstrate that they were almost exactly, but not quite, like their corresponding books in our own world. "What do you mean, our own world?" Emily asked, taken aback. "No way. It's the only explanation. I didn't do this, believe me." I could tell Emily wasn't sure what to believe as we replaced the books, this time leaving the others as they were. I had a notion we might try an experiment. We turned a dozen text strands, spines facing out, as it should be. We both closed our eyes, entirely aware that what we were doing felt crazy. "No cheating now," I insisted. "Eyes firmly shut and count to 100. We both did so, aloud, giving the invisible book fairies adequate opportunity to work their magic. It was with a palpable sense of disappointment, therefore, when we opened our eyes to see that nothing had changed. The colourful spines of the few books we'd replaced stood out along long lines of undifferentiated white paper. "I suppose you could claim it's a new concept in bookselling," Emily offered wryly. I laughed, despite my bafflement, a hollow laugh that developed into a full hysterical fit of giggles. It was a moment or two after the echoes of that laugh died away that I heard it. A faint voice, my own voice, muffled and indistinct, the delicate hint of an Ayrshire accent, the slight lisp on F's that is part of my idiolect, undeniably me, but elsewhere. Actually, somewhere specific, the voice issuing from behind the stacks, murmuring in amazement the phrase, "Emily, come see, it's happening again." And there you are. Very peculiar little story there. A little update on my progress for anyone who cares. I've had something like 16 stories accepted now, and about a dozen things published, mostly online, but 3 or 4 in print. So I'm making progress. I have made hundreds of submissions, however, so I think my success rate is somewhere around 8%, which isn't bad, but it could be better. Anyway, this one I have fairly high hopes for, so I'm going to send that out to some magazines publishing strange tales and see what happens. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you again very soon. Bye.